hope you will forgive me for these minutes that we lost. I do my best. I am happy to keep in contact again. And if you don't mind, I start immediately. My schedule will not change much. Well, my schedule is flexible. Now, good evening, Mr. President, and I hope that in case there is any problem, technical or in terms of discourse, you will simply interrupt me and tell me, please do this or do that.
Good evening, Professor. How are you? This is Tadeo.
Yeah, oh, Tadeo, yeah, good evening. I was in trouble because I do not know what kind of complications we had at the moment.
I don't think we have any, but if you could please simply adjust your screen a little so we can see you better, that'd be great.
Yes, a traditional
That's
mistake of
perfect.
mine. Is it
Perfect.
better like this?
Yes, this is perfect. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So, and there we go. So, about my timing, technical matters, I intend to stop at, I intend to stop quarter to midnight or 20 minutes to midnight in order to have time for some questions. Further questions can be forwarded by email and so on. Now, I do not know to what extent the topic of our aula tonight, our lecture, to what extent this topic is well known among you. So if anyone has already been dealing with indirect translations. Now, I'll ask this question again in a moment. Uh, but before doing anything, so I was looking for a topic that was fit, that was well prepared for introducing us into many areas of the study of translation and even not only of translation. Now, I suggest that we read the text at this moment. We read it together and we'll take our time because it's important. So here we go. It's a text that I borrow from a source that maybe you don't like too much, and I have my problems myself, but I know a little bit where this text comes from, and I read it as an important text for our session. Here we go. Indirect translation is a translation from a translated version or multiple translated versions of the ultimate source text. For instance, if a text in Arabic is translated into Portuguese via English, the result is indirect translation. That's what we call it. This practice is a long-standing reality, and we'll deal a lot with that. So through the ages and through the cultures, the question of indirect translation is not unknown. One of my surprises is precisely, it's not only my surprise, one of the surprises is that scholars so far have a little bit, well, the scholars in translation studies, and not only in translation studies, have overlooked this practice. This translation practice is a long-standing reality of intercultural exchanges, especially exchanges involving the so-called small languages. Now remember this. Indirect translation remains a common practice in various areas of today's society. So not only in the past, machine translation, audiovisual translation, community interpreting, conference interpreting, and its use has become more pronounced with the successive enlargements of the European Union. Wikipedia borrows this quote from Yves Gambier, who is a well-known colleague and I'm sure who is also well-known in China. In translation studies, indirect translation is sometimes referred to by the abbreviation and so on, relay. I don't see my screen fully. It's also known as double, intermediate, mediated, mixed, pivot, relay, or second-hand translation. Indirect translations are sometimes called retranslations. Well, okay, this is the problem of terminology, but that's only the beginning. And after all, we have other things to discover than terminology. The abbreviation. So I'll use ITR and so on. Now I come back to my question, and maybe even I could have some aspects or some components of an answer, because I would like to know a little bit if I speak about things from, say, from another world. So indirect translation, has anyone among you been dealing with it, either from the perspective of research or from the perspective of practice, the production of translations? So I interrupt for a while. Maybe there is a technique that allows us to know if there's any answer at this moment. Mr. President, maybe you help me, but I'm waiting. I'm going to answer as a member of my audience. I would like to answer in rather direct terms. I would say, of course, you are experienced with indirect translation, but in fact, you did not really realize so. So you probably have been in contact. May, may I listen? I have the impression that there is an answer. Now, okay, well, you can always interrupt me. I give you two kinds of simple examples. So what do we mean when dealing with indirect translation, or with one of these phenomena that have been identified with other terms? First of all, I'm sure that several among you have produced translations. Maybe you have always been in the comfortable situation when you have been selected because you were competent in the languages that were needed. But from the moment you are in relation with texts and audiences that involve more than two languages, you may have a problem. You may have a problem. Now, suppose I I'm listening. Is there any answer or question at this moment? So you understand my voice, I hope. That's not a problem. So you understand my discussion. Thank you. Well, When I was younger, one of my first computers was an Italian one. And maybe you know the name. The name was Olivetti. Now, at that moment, my Italian was not very good, but these documents that come together with the computer very often produce text in more than one language. And as always, nowadays, you have the English translation. There's a mistake here. But so the English translation was helping us. So in such a case, I was reading the user's guide to my family, and they understood more or less. So I translated into Dutch, that's the language of my family, and I translated into Dutch from English. Well, okay, that's what we would call in traditional terms indirect translation. So when do we make use of indirect translation? Very often when there is no translator available for the language that is supposed to produce the important text for you. That's the situation of people who translate. But there's a situation that is much more an academic situation for people who are involved in research. Now, I give a few examples, and maybe you remember already that one day or another, one of the many days in our life, you have been involved with translations of that kind. I happen to know, well, I have been several times in South Africa. You may know that the language used in South Africa by certain people, quite a few people, and by a few important writers, one among them, for instance, is André Brink. If I'm not mistaken, he got the Nobel Prize. Now, Nobel Prizes very often are being translated after they get the Nobel Prize into more than one language. And very often they are translated, say, from English and not from their own tongue. Now, I happen to know André Brink, and I'm almost sure he published in Afrikaans. Afrikaans is one of the local languages. I know that André Brink, his mother tongue was Afrikaans. I know well because one day I had the honor of being next to him during one of the meals there. But of course, Nobel Prize means that people get into the international press, and very often, immediately, one of the English publishers tries to get the monopoly of that text, and then they translate from that text. So an indirect translation of André Brink's into Dutch. I am almost sure that there are other texts of that kind. The title I mentioned there after this, I'm not going to explain now, but it's a fascinating novel, something like the equivalent of Alice Walker. So you know the novel by Alice Walker, remarkable novel, well, a South African novel of the same kind. I am sure that from Afrikaans into Dutch, no one would try to translate that in direct translation. But the next case is a little bit simpler. Garcia Marquez, I think also a Nobel Prize. I happen to know that the translations into Dutch, well, you may know a little bit about my own country, and I'm not going to talk much about my country, But Dutch is used in the northern part of Belgium, Flanders, and also in the Netherlands. Now, the publishing system in Flanders is much weaker and much less enterprising than the Dutch one. So you can be sure that the writers from Latin America, and especially those writers who belong together with Garcia Marquez, who belong to the so-called Latin American boom. So a very successful generation. Well, it's even more or less sure that these writers got famous worldwide because of their success in English. But the Dutch publishing houses were first in producing translations into Dutch. They were among the first languages and cultures in Western Europe to distribute the Latin American boom from the moment they were successful. Now, I happen to know, because some of my students studied this, I happen to know that the Latin American writers from that generation, who were successful also in the Netherlands and in my country, that they were translated not only via French, but they were translated from Spanish. There are quite a few people in my country who understand Spanish. But since many people feel less at ease with Spanish than with French, these Latin American writers have been translated in a combination of texts coming from Paris, the French translations, who were probably much faster still than the Dutch ones. So many among these translations have been distributed in indirect translations. I would say that for us, this is not a real surprise. I would say this is not a real surprise. Why? Because we are a bit familiar with indirect translations. And I'll explain already a little bit some of the discussions. I'll anticipate some of the discussions by saying that in so-called peripheral languages, and I take Dutch among the peripheral languages in Western Europe, so it's not that unknown to get translations coming from, say, German, sometimes from Russian. This depends on the circumstances. What is much more a surprise is that in the European Union, indirect translation is not unknown at all. I mentioned Gambier, and in the bibliography that you will receive, maybe not tonight, in the bibliography you will see that research in translation studies that has started around indirect translation, that's a recent phenomenon. Yves Gambier published one of the creative articles, and he knows well the European Union. Now, in the European Union, as you know, there are more than 20 languages involved, and they have translators, more than one, from almost every language. Nevertheless, in the European Union, in their administration and in their meetings, it's not at all unknown and uncommon that not the speaker's text, when he's speaking to the microphone, not the speaker's text is translated, because he may speak Russian or he may speak Czech, or he may speak Hungarian. Now, of course, there are translators in the European Union that are familiar in Hungarian. Then the problem is who exactly is listening to this translation. One of the problems of the European Union is they have so many languages and translations that it's not always clear who is listening or reading a given text. But in the European Union, very often, and especially in interpreting, the people responsible for the organization call one of the translators who is familiar with, say, Hungarian, excuse me, with Hungarian, and who translates in one of the languages that are needed. Say just for pragmatic reasons, because not you know how an organization works, and with many languages and many translators, not always they have at their disposal all the various colleagues who are able to translate. And then the use of an indirect translation is an easy solution. So indirect translation, yeah. One of the problems, so it may be a surprise that the European Union makes use of indirect translations. Now I mention here IBM. I'm not sure there are many indirect translations in IBM. Why? Well, later we'll discuss questions like why. Because the English used by IBM, so you all know the company, I guess, and you know their role in the development of electronics. Now, since IBM produces texts and disseminates them in English, almost all international translators nowadays have access to English and are able to translate directly from English. So one of our questions will be, when do we have indirect translations? And then there are lots of other questions. So the translator will ask such a question. The problem will be what kind of consequences this has. Does it have any consequence or not? I'm going to read for you in a while text that indicates that people don't always like indirect translations. So people, and not only translators, but also scholars. I am sure that the translators that you know, if they have to produce a text, say the translation of a letter or the translation of an article in a newspaper, when they do not have the article, the text in the original language, they will probably say, oh, moment, but I can't translate then. So they are wondering, can I translate from another language, in this case, and say from the language that is used by the speaker, whether it may be Chinese or English. So in Europe, Chinese would of course be a problem. English would probably not be a problem among translators. Here I write back to our quote, but I don't think we even need that. So in the quote, there are some indications. So it's more than a definition of indirect translation. In that text from Wikipedia, the experts, I'm going to show who these experts are. I happen to know a little bit the backgrounds of that article in Wikipedia. It's clear that not everyone who is experienced in translation matters is happy with indirect translations. Now, how comes that these indirect translations seem to be widely distributed? So that's a soft expression. Later, I'll show you that in the history of mankind, from the point of view of our contemporary age, but also from the point of view of the past, indirect translations are, say, everywhere. And very often we don't suspect them to be there. So, why and how do people solve the problem of translation? And why do they make use of indirect translation? Both translators and also the users of the language, very often people who will be suggested to make use of an indirect translation will say, oh, I'm sorry, but you have no translation from the original language, Chinese, English, or whatever. And in that quote that I have given you from Wikipedia, it's already indicated that one of the problems that plays a role is the distance between the origin of the message and, say, the readers or the users. But distance is a bad concept because it's not necessarily a matter of distance. English for people in China nowadays is hardly a problem, for at least for people who have a certain degree of education. For Japanese, it's more a problem. And in my own country, for the northern part of the country, for Flemish ones, it's hardly a problem at all. For the Francophones, it's more a problem. So it's not just a matter of distance. There are other components that play a role. Well, but we are dealing with research on translation. So, in case indirect translation is, say, widespread, in case indirect translation is widespread, one could ask what scholars need to say about that and how. Now, what kind of questions could we apply to this? And after all, maybe we are not really looking for research questions, but very often researchers have to solve problems. So how will researchers, and especially researchers in translation studies, how will they approach the question of indirect translation? Now, I'm afraid I need to give a statement that is very disappointing. One can say that research on translation so far has not really concentrated on indirect translation. So there's a problem. Why and so on, we'll come to that. But suppose that translation studies now take seriously indirect translation, and that's my suggestion, and not only mine. I'll show you how research in translation studies, little by little and rather hesitantly, starts focusing also on indirect translation. To tell you this, but again, this will come back. I know quite a few colleagues in research on translation who tell us when we try to explain how we deal with, say, indirect translation, their question is, oh, indirect translation. Is this also translation? And this is a short answer giving in, well, with some despise, the idea that they have doubts about the relevance of not only indirect translation, but even research on indirect translation. So what's behind that? We'll see. I'll show you one of the articles from one of our young scholars. I'll explain where they come from and what they are doing. In one of the articles, a good article, there's something like a program for research on indirect translation. Now, maybe we learn already a few things when we try to run through the list of questions of that kind. So, what could be the goal of research on indirect translation? The lady who produced that article uses a very simple didactic formula, and she speaks about the key questions for research on translation of any kind. And she speaks about the 5 W's. W, so like the first letter in the question, why? So why has a given translation been produced via an indirect translation? Now there are other questions, and you will see immediately what kind of questions. And I'll show you that these questions are linked with a very particular kind of research on translation, and a particular kind that is very young. And I have arguments for supposing that in a culture like yours, in China, this research on indirect translation will provide insights, not only about translation, but about relations between societies and cultures and so much more. At this moment, I'll stop this kind of, I would say, brainstorming about questions for research by listing a few among these questions. So the W questions: why? When exactly has such an indirect translation been produced? This implies that indirect translations have not always been produced. I could even give again the example of my culture, but I'm not going to refer to that. So when do we have indirect translations? Why? Now, a very important question for you. So belonging to a big country in Asia, where now it's almost predictable in what kind of areas, geographical and geocultural areas, indirect translation is in use, in what kind of situations, and so on. So you see the problem. This is a full program, and I refer to that further. I would say these are the key questions from research that is called in contemporary translation studies, descriptive translation studies. Of course, there may be other questions, but these questions seem to be key ones. I have told you already that very often the question to the concept indirect translation is this also translation? After all, when we analyze well such a question, so my reply would be, why would this not be a translation? In the quote we have read that indirect translation is different from average translation, if this exists, or maybe we call it direct translation, but that's more delicate. So indirect translation seems to be different to the extent that in the case of indirect translation, the original is already a translation, and a translation, in general terms, in another language. So can we call this translation? I could give you examples. I remember an excellent paper by an excellent colleague, but coming from organization studies. Organization studies somewhere between sociology and economics. And we asked her, so she was dealing with translation in very intelligent terms. We all know that sociology nowadays produces remarkable text on translation. Now, she was wondering about the features of translation in the society, and we asked her, it was a she, I'm not going to mention her name, but it's a big name. We asked her, okay, how would a question like indirect translation fit into your arguments? And this lady was not unprepared at all, but she said, yes, but I have checked. I don't think that we can accept indirect translation as a translation. Okay, no further comments on this lady and her answer, but I know scholars, and I know the kind of scholars who would share her answer. Now, I would say from my point of view, I would accept such an answer as one of the remnants of the traditional so-called normative attitude. I mean this normative attitude. You probably know about the question of norms in translation, and you know that the experts of this so-called, well, say descriptive translation studies, that they try to avoid dealing with translation in terms of good and bad. Now, when colleagues say, is this also a translation when dealing with indirect translation? This seems to echo the idea, yes, but translation is already a problem in itself. Suppose we deal with lawyers and we say, I have the translation of your text here about this or that stuff. Oh, and the lawyer looks and he says, yeah, but this is a translation. You all know, I guess you all know, that most lawyers exclude translation from their worldview. So is this also a translation? Means translation is already a problem, but indirect translation, that's worse, much worse. Now, the fact is that I know also many people in many societies who would hardly worry about the translation when they say, I have a translation from another language. So what kind of a text is that, an indirect translation, and who is dealing with it? I would even say that, at least for the people that I know at Shanghai, not that many, but they would worry from the moment they know that they deal with translations, and even more when they deal with indirect translations. and I would not blame them at all. This is the problem of someone who is going to make use of translations. The problem for scholars may be different. Maybe they are glad to deal with indirect translations. And I would even say I belong a little bit to that group. In the United States, in many situations, I'm sure you would get a very different answer. Now, I'm not sure, it depends on the people and so on. So it has to do, and we'll see that. So it has to do with the kind of societies that deal with these texts. Now, societies, one of the problems for these societies in their relation with translation is how common for them is it to make use of translations? Would they be part of their world? Are they aware of them? And I give one example, and I can't apply it to your situation in China, but in one of the recent reading jobs that I had, there was an article about American universities. Now, there was a statement about students in American universities that was amazing. Well, amazing, not really for me, but that would certainly appear to be amazing for people like Donald Trump or whoever you have in mind as people who are in charge of official jobs on behalf of the United States as a nation. But the statement about languages at universities in the United States was the following one: 20% of the students at American universities make use of another language than English when they are at home. Now, one of the expectations I have, we'll come to that, one of the expectations I have is that in societies where the awareness of other languages is higher or lower, the treatment of translations is different, and much more even the treatment of indirect translation. So I would accept the idea that indirect translations are something like a double test. I wouldn't say a double blind test in relation with translation, but it's an interesting item for remarks about verbal communication. But now we are a little bit in trouble, and I'll show you that this has an important historical background. So there are certainly several, well, there is, I would say, maybe a large percentage of researchers dealing with translation who would exclude indirect translation from the definition translation, and who would, of course, exclude indirect translation from research on translation issues. Now, the interesting point is, and that's why I have selected this item, the interesting question is that the attitude towards indirect translation on behalf of translation studies has changed a lot in recent years. Why? So what's behind that? I would say it looks a little bit, well, I don't like the word, but it looks stupid to exclude indirect translation from research on translation. Maybe we learn something, say, indirectly. But this is the more delicate, since we know on the basis of quite some academic word in our academic world, we know that many texts in the history of mankind, important texts, have been circulating around the globe in translation, of course, by definition. So how can you be a classic in, say, world literature? Or even more, how can you be, or how can we accept that there have been philosophers in ancient times that have been disseminated worldwide, of course in translation, but in translations via what we call intermediate languages. I give you an example from some of my recent experiences. I had to report on research about a fascinating topic, especially in our painful days around COVID. I mean Chinese medicine. So how do we in the Western world know anything about Chinese medicine? Of course, because there are texts and there are competent doctors who are familiar with Chinese medicine, maybe less than in your country. But there's not only Chinese medicine. I had to report on medicine from the Chinese perspective, but Western medicine. Now I had to laugh a little bit. It was kind of a joke. How can you deal with the importation of Western medicine in China in days like now when we have COVID and heaven knows what more? Now it's clear that Chinese medicine has a big name through the ages. I do not know where the contacts between Chinese societies and Chinese speaking societies, where they have started. But it is clear that Chinese medicine is not only known in China and in one or two countries in the so-called West. No, Chinese medicine is something like a concept that all people involved in medicine must meet one day or another. I'm not really an expert in the distribution of the works of Karl Marx, but I am sure that Karl Marx is known worldwide. I'm sure he is known because he has been translated. Now, I have tried to stimulate research on that kind of topics. Even last time I did so was in Australia. When you are in countries that are, I would say, at a certain distance, I refer to that initial text. So at a certain distance from, say, Germany, and at a certain distance from countries that have used Karl Marx and his ideas as a basis for political and social behavior, I am sure that his texts have been distributed in many different languages and very often via indirect translations. Now, I'm not sure that research is lacking about the confrontation of the French Karl Marx with the English Karl Marx. I even think I have been reading a few texts about that. It's clear that the question of indirect translation for experts in philosophy or whatever, or sociology, that they would listen well when we try to examine I would say, the kind of translation that have been produced of the text of Karl Marx. Now, a very general basic statement for our lecture. In case indirect translation would be excluded from translation studies, would not be part of the object of study, then we could worry and say, well, after all, if this is not part of the question of translation studies, after all, why exactly do we need translation studies? I mean that one of the decisive arguments underlying my discussion and underlying the researchers that I'm going to introduce to you, several among them are known, the philosophy would be that translation and indirect translation teach us a lot, of course, about translation, but about relationships between languages, yes, societies, yes, politics, probably, religion, yes. So how can we say that universities have no responsibilities in the research about indirect translations from the contemporary perspective and from the diachronic perspective? So historical and in terms of synchrony in the contemporary age. So these are very heavy questions. Now, I can tell you that such questions are at the origin of the creation of translation studies, and many among the texts that are at the origin of the creation of translation studies are well known, but the link with questions such as translation studies are not very visible. Now, I'll show you how the creation of translation studies, so the foundation of the new discipline, was linked with arguments like the ones that I support now. I give them a name, and this name is used and not very often about the kind of theoretical approaches that I'm going to show to you or to discuss with you. I call them, and they are not often called like that, although the concept is well known, but it's not that systematically applied to these theoreticians. I call this origin of translation studies and this approach to translation studies and to translation, I call it the functional approach. The question is not really, is this translation? The question is rather, some people call this translation, and many people who were asked to produce a translation of that text, a text in another language, made use of another translation. Now, for the function that they were allotting to these texts, this was sufficient. Now, in the history of mankind, this is such an enormous tradition that we can say that in case research on translation excludes this because it does not enter the definition of the object of study by a given scholar or by scholars I would call this the blindness of scholars. So scholars can be struck with blindness. If this kind of translation phenomenon is excluded from research on translation, I would say there's something, as we say after Hamlet, something rotten in the state of Denmark. Now, the key question is this, and you may be familiar with this. So far, I didn't hear any reply about that. The question is, if we have to accept that a given object can be called translation, who exactly decides about this? The scholar in 2021 or in 1980, or the people involved in the production and in that kind of society where people have such an idea about translation? So is translation a historical phenomenon, or is it a matter of techniques and so on? So from the moment in a translation, there's not this or that or that. If we say this is sufficient for excluding it, we are supposed to check and to counter check this, not just with my daughter or my father, but with culture and societies. Now, maybe you are familiar with that kind of logics. I borrow it from, I would say, from the scholar who has produced a book that is read more than any scholarly book on translation, that is the Israeli Gidon Toury. The book Descriptive Translation Studies is supporting exactly that kind of logics. Now, there were heavy discussion about that. Okay, let's continue. How comes research on indirect translation is starting just in very recent years? Does this mean that societies did not know about this? No. So there are interesting books from before the start of translation studies about indirect translation, and by people who were hardly familiar with any scholarly work on translation studies. So why has research on translation started that late? I'll give you, but in a shorthand style, I'll give you a short history of on indirect translation. It's like, so why has translation been so systematically excluded from universities until a given moment? And why have universities suddenly been booming, and publishing houses and so on? Many people at universities make use of translations. For instance, that's one of my points. Classes on medicine, on mathematics, on philosophy, sociology, physics are full of translated texts. Not the book itself is entirely translated. It's full of quotes from other languages and so on. And I am sure that in almost all disciplines, it's full of indirect translations in the key handbooks. So far, universities have not really accepted this very general statement, so they seem to be interested suddenly in departments dealing with translation. Maybe because they want to train translators. But I'm afraid this is not a sufficient argument. We need much more. If we want to train good translators, we need to know a little bit more about the question of translation in society. But okay. I'll be short for matters of time. I'll be short about names and people. I have already sent these documents to you. I hope you can have access to them, and I shall add quite a bit of bibliography and good bibliography that will reach you. Now I also come to the people that have produced these texts in Wikipedia. How comes in indirect translation has suddenly been noticed not by intellectuals? So there are good intellectuals in the Middle Ages and so on who were talking about that, not in the terminology and in the concept that we use now, but the awareness of indirect translation has been clear for a certain time. The problem is that now we want to deal with it in terms of a scholarly discipline, and this implies a certain canonization of rules, a standardization of rules, and so on. Now, I'm going to explain with a simple example, and you'll forgive me. I'll make use of my own past. So you may know, we'll come to that. You may know that I was the main organizer of the conference at my own university, Leuven, where translation studies has been starting. So this is written down in many basic books on translation. That was in 1976. Before 1976, I was not really an expert in translation studies, but I was involved in an area of research where it was hard to ignore translation. Now, in my first lecture, I have spoken about world literature, comparative literature, and so on, and translation studies. Now, my PhD was a PhD in comparative literature. I explain a few things more, but it could be comparative literature between, say, China and Korea, or China and Vietnam, or China and India, or China and Japan, or whatever. Now, I made a PhD on, say, 1.5 centuries of contacts between German literature and French literature. I'll be more precise because it was more specific. So it was between 1800 and 1950. And I was focusing on a German writer, but belonging to a very particular moment in German culture and literature. I was focusing on a German writer in France during almost 2 centuries. And of course, besides that writer, I had to look for many other writers. So it was much more than a thesis about one writer in his reception in a neighbor country. Now, I have mentioned reception, so you know what reception means in comparative literature. It has a very particular tradition and even reputation. It was controversial at a given moment. Now, for me, that was in the 1960s, 1970s. sorry, I didn't want to speak about my age. Now my age has nothing to do with it. But in that period, comparative literature had already a rich tradition of research about the interaction between traditional literatures, national literatures. But the big surprise was that in this kind of research, the question of translation was rather systematically excluded. So remember what I just told about indirect translation being excluded. And I felt very bad at ease because after all, this is like transforming the dynamics of literary activities during 1.5 centuries into something much more static. I mean, the exact kind of activities of readers, writers, critics who get in touch with a given book from the other country. So for me, it was obvious that translation was missing. At that moment, I had no real idea about the best approach to that. I discovered a few books and I started reading, I would say, almost all translation theories from that moment. Now, maybe you imagine what these translation theories looked like at that moment. Now, my conclusion was very radical and very painful. That was that I hardly read anything in these interesting and intelligent books. The conclusion was that I read hardly anything that applied to the dozens and dozens and dozens of translations that I had read, studied, compared, confronted with ideas in those years through the ages. And this was the case for translations from the beginning of the 19th century, but this was also for different reasons, but also the case for texts from the middle of the 20th century. So why do we have translation theories if they have nothing to do with translations from culture? I would not say from the past, because I had several difficulties with contemporary translations. I'll be a little bit more precise because you may be surprised. I'll be more precise. In these texts, in all these texts, I could discover that in the translation there were deletions. So translators were cutting, but they also did the opposite. They added words, expressions, sessions, location of space, names, or they deleted a chapter, or they changed the order of chapters. Now, I was extremely critical, skeptical about translation theories after having read them. Now, when we start, that's one of the reasons why, well, I had colleagues. I had an excellent colleague, his name will come, who was making a PhD on literary translation. Of course, I spoke to him about this. He was a great fan of the translation theories in Czechoslovakia and so on. And he got me in touch with one of his friends, and his friend was James Holmes. Now, James Holmes got famous. So the real beginning of translation studies as a discipline comes from James Holmes, The Name and Nature of Translation Studies. Now, okay, via him and so on, we got in touch with other colleagues and we decided to organize a conference on translation phenomena, on the translation phenomenon. Now that's the title. I know it from some of the centers in China or near China. I know that some of the centers for translation studies claim to deal not with translation, but with translation phenomena. Now, in my case, for comparative literature, and that's what's going to be confirmed in my case, I'm not that sure that I was really fascinated by translation. Of course, it's such a fascinating phenomenon. But the heart of the matter maybe was rather how to explain that translation is there, is distributed. Why is it like this or that, and why does it change, and so on. Now, this was I would say, the philosophy underlying our Congress at Leuven in 1976, and you know it, and I guess you know it, I'll show it. Well, here is the title, Literature and Translation, New Perspectives in Literary Studies. That was the title of our symposium, and the key man was James Holmes. Now, the big surprise for me, and I'll show you the big surprise and the big event of that conference, which was an extraordinary conference with discussions much more than just papers, and discussions with people from very different origins. Not that many, something like 55. But this was so, I would say, so revealing, so fundamental. Now, one of the things that we are that we have been obliged to revise is the title of that symposium. Now, you know how universities organize conferences. They give a given conference and a budget to a given department. Now you have to work on behalf of the department. One of our very simple conclusions was that the question of translation, of course, is fascinating in literature, but the question of translation is much more than a question of literature. So literature plays a very interesting, remarkable role, and so on. But okay, now the big surprise in that conference was the position occupied by two colleagues. I met them for the first time in relation with that conference, and you certainly know their name. And I'll first mention the name of the youngest one between them. And the youngest one among them, the youngest one did not even have his PhD. He was finishing his PhD. Now, this gentleman was, you guessed so, it was Gideon Toury. Now, the key position of Toury is in that conference. I'll come back to his master, Ibn Zohar, Itamar Ibn Zohar. He indicated Toury and he said, this is a very important young scholar. But Ibn Zohar was very important also. He was a member of our committee. As one, at that moment, he was teaching at the University of Amsterdam in the center where Holmes was teaching. Now, the big surprise was the position adopted by Toury and even by Ibn Zohar. I would say a little bit like the question of indirect translation. I did not discuss that much the question of definition. Now, one of the new things in the approach to translation was that Toury was not that much worried about the question. Very surprisingly, the question, what exactly is translation? His key problem was not the definition. The question was, translation is a phenomenon in culture that is distributed everywhere. Now, how does this work? At that moment, we were very dissatisfied. You have heard so about translation theories. At that moment, it was very clear that almost all important translation theories located themselves within linguistics. And it was also very obvious, including for us, that translation is heavily depending on languages and questions of language and linguistics. Now, the starting point in Toury's paper, his first international paper, that was the start of his career, that ended in 2009. No, 16, I guess. But he stopped working actively. Now, his first paper was The Nature and Role of Norms in Literary Translation. Later, he will drop the word literary because he was speaking about much more than literature. Now, his argument from the beginning to the end was the question of translation is not simply a matter of language or languages only, it's a matter of norms. Norms apply to language, norms apply to time, to language level, say style, whatever. In the case of literary text, a question of genre and so on. The question of norms had an enormous signification at that moment, a meaning. It was a revolution because it meant that the monopoly for the approach to translation, the monopoly of linguistics was broken because language was a question within a larger set of rules, norms, regularities, call them as you like. Now, later by other people, this revolution will be called, and they did not really recognize the crucial role played by Toury. This was in 1976 in the paper by Toury, the cultural turn, because the question of how do people translate, how do people require translations, so the full communication system was involved. Now, the question of language is an important issue. It's not the monopoly of that kind of communication. Now, okay, that was one of the surprises. But one of the big objections from translation scholars and from the famous translation scholars at that moment was, yes, but what's your definition of translation? And they were working with what we called already at that moment immediately normative definitions. Normative definitions, by normative definitions, I mean the kind of definitions that I have just explained about indirect translation. I mean, when the translation scholar tells what translation is, instead of looking how translation functions in culture, then it means that the scholar becomes normative. Now, one of the consequences of that new approach in Toury's young work, was that translation had to be observed and to be studied from the beginning to the end. because translation theories that were so well distributed had not done this. They were dealing, as Toury said, with an unexistent object of study. Translation has to be studied. This was, of course, a clear option for an empirical approach to translation. Now, I don't see how translation studies can do without empirical approach. Maybe it requires more. I'm sure it requires more. But the empirical cultural approach was the beginning of that approach to translation. Now, I give here the names and so on. Susan Bassnett and André Lefebvre later have said that they have initiated the cultural turn in translation studies, but there are lots of reasons why we can say that they were certainly not representative of the general approach developed in those years and later on in translation studies, especially by Toury, I would even say by myself and so on. Now I'm going to move on because our time is running, but I'll indicate a few very important questions, and it's now that I'm going to show how you can get involved in the study of indirect translation. Because one of the additional reasons why, say, Western, I don't like the name, why Western translation studies, why they have neglected so heavily indirect translation, it's because the worldview of people dealing with culture interaction and so on, even like in comparative literature. In comparative literature, it's a little bit different, but it's clear that the worldview is too narrow. As you read in that quote from Wikipedia, it's clear that indirect translation is more distributed when you have long distance contacts and contacts between very different cultures or between languages that have hardly any contact and so on. Now, one of the surprises, even one of the surprises in recent days and hours, is how important indirect translation is on your own continent. I do not know that much about the literary context, but I have quite a few references. But indirect translation in the distribution of Chinese texts in the Western world, I have lots of bibliographical references here, and you will see them also in the work of the young people that I'm going to introduce now in a few words. That's very simple. So here you have this scheme. Now, there is a surprise. That one of the surprises is that the kind of approach to translation that we have been advocating since the mid 70s, especially under the impact of Toury and even Zohar, that this kind of research has developed in research networks and in research groups after that. Now, the new research on indirect translation is coming mainly, I'm proud to say so, I'm also embarrassed, but this indirect research is coming mainly from the center that I have created in '89, CETRA. We have trained a little bit less than 1,000 scholars from 5 continents. Now there are some chances to have good disciples among them. And CETRA in '89 was, I would say, a little bit imitated and developed by the European Society for Translation Studies. Now, these two institutes, I was hardly aware of it at a given moment, I had to correct them. I was not involved. I'm not involved at all anymore in their work. But in the European Society for Translation Studies, they started up their project and they were speaking about indirect translation in, no, indirect literary translation. Now I have written a message to the society saying that I was glad with the topic, but that as far as I could notice, it was a disadvantage to reduce the question of indirect translation to literature because this was going to make them blind, struck with blindness, like so many scholars who don't look for the complexity of translation in cultures and so on. Now, a little bit before we started our research, for instance, at Symposium in Leuven, there was a very interesting group of scholars in Göttingen dealing with translated literature. I say translated literature and not literary translation. I have reasons for this. Now, Jürgen von Stackelberg published a title. I have not well written the title. Übersetzungen aus zweiter Hand, second-hand translations. It was about European literature, but he noticed that he had discovered a remarkable topic, and he had two PhD students, good PhD students, and they devoted their PhD to a project that was of European relevance, incredible relevance, because you may know that European literature in the 18th century, little by little, started discovering prose narratives, and the great novelists from the 18th century in England, and you probably know them better than I do, Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, Lawrence Sterne, and so on. Well, these writers and their novels were very successful on the European continent. If you know a little bit of work by Goethe and so on, you know how all these people were fascinated by a new kind of literature, prose, because elsewhere prose narratives were not really accepted. They were excluded from literary life. Now, these texts have been translated systematically and several times into German, sometimes first, not always first. They have been translated also into French. This was happening almost at the same time. But the remarkable phenomenon was that almost every translation into German coming from these novels was produced, I would say, on the basis of two texts. That was the English original and the French translations. French was the dominant language, the lingua franca from that moment. And the Germans justified their behavior by saying that the French at least knew how to write. So these English writers were fascinating, but they didn't know how to write. So you needed, there was a lot more. So, but this was a real surprise for us, and it was a fascinating, well, a surprise. It was not really a surprise for me and for comparatists and so on. Now, this is one of the reasons why indirect translation was already a fascinating topic for us long before they started, long before the end of the 20th century. And Toury discussed several phenomena of that kind. But a few young scholars from these groups have been starting up a research project, and they even have a website that is mentioned at the bottom of this page, Indirect Trans, and they have remarkable bibliography. Now, The names I mentioned here, Yves Gambier was a colleague in our institute, not only in our institute, he's really very famous. But then the students, Cecilia, oh, I made printing mistakes, Cecilia Alstad, Martine Ringmar, and so on. All these people, Peter Bologna is even the director of my research institute at Leuven at this moment. So they did, oh, what's happening? Oh, yeah, I don't know what happened here, but okay. Okay, no problem. I can finish here. We have to finish, but there's so much more to be told. Now, that I could say that's easy for me to mention. For instance, one of the important books on the European Shakespeare by two other colleagues of mine, Dirk de la Bastida and Levenhulst. They are famous. Now, a lot in the Shakespeare distribution in Europe was indirect. For instance, Dutch translations were indirect. Portuguese translations were indirect and were used as a mediating system for other cultures. In Spain and in Italy, they made use of that kind of thing. Even modern writers now, Agatha Christie and so on, or as I told you, the Latin American boom. Now, it's clear that European culture, and especially the so-called peripheral cultures, were eager to translate, but very often they made use of other languages for several reasons. First of all, because their knowledge of languages very often is very complex. They know it's like Poland and the Slavic languages in Europe and so on. Now, there is a remarkable work by a Spanish colleague, and she is teaching at Hong Kong Baptist University, Mayalen Marin, and so on, three names. Now, she published a remarkable work about the translation of contemporary Chinese literature into Spanish, and so on. And she's not that well initiated with translation studies, but she's making remarkable points about it. I know a book published in Paris by people who are not involved in translation studies at all, but which is a remarkable synthesis of translations from Chinese into the European languages, and so on. Now, why is this so important? Now, I make use now of the ideas by people like, say, Ibn Zohar and so on. Ibn Zohar has a strong influence in these texts by Wikipedia. Now, it's clear that the position on the world, on the globe, the position on the globe reflects very heavy tendencies in matters of translation culture. One of the translation cultures is indirect translation, and so on. And the basic theories, the so-called polysystem theories, have been defined and developed for the first time by Ibn Zohar in 76, together with the ideas of his pupils. So you can see that, I would say, the question of world literature, I was very, very aggressive in my commentary on comparatists and their treatment of world literature, and especially the fact that they excluded translation. Well, translation, and especially direct translation, is one of the key components in the dynamics of interaction between cultures. That's what I want to show you, and you can take part in that kind of work. Use that website by these young people and read whatever you find. Thank you. Now I'm going to stop. It's time for me to stop, but maybe you want to ask a few questions, and I hope to be able to answer immediately. If you prefer making use of the written form and email, you are very welcome. And I hope that you are not too tired for having a few questions now. So, Mr. President, maybe you help us in order we need to organize a little bit our interaction. I would be very glad. I also see Tadeu, our colleague technician at the University of Fortaleza. Thank you for helping. Maybe
Very welcome.
if you see technical problems that I'm not aware of, please tell us. But
I don't think we've run into any issues so far. We actually only have the one question on YouTube from our very own Professor Mahielen Torres. May I read it?
Yes, tell me again from whom? Who is
from Professor Mahielen Torres.
Oh yeah, very good, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to read it to you. José, can we say or affirm that the presence of indirect translation reveals a certain vision of the world, a certain cultural vision of the other that is translated through a language culture that is important for the one who uses it? What is the impact, the power of indirect translation?
Can you repeat the last sentence?
Yes, the last section of her question reads, a certain cultural vision of the other that is translated through a language culture that is important for the one who uses it. What is the impact or the power of indirect translation?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Marie-Hélène. I hope that the audience has also understood. Tadeu read it very well, but I try to detail a little bit my answer, and that will help you also to understand several components in the question. And maybe I overlook certain components in that question, so you may tell me again. My first rather short and radical reply is going to the final sentences. That is, of course, insisting again, not for the first time, but in a good context, that is insisting heavily on one of the, I would say, one of the components of the translation landscapes. I would call them the landscapes. So I mean, if you want this, if you want us to avoid dealing all the time, as has been done so often and for so many years by scholars in the humanities. So if we want to have a more flexible view on the globe, we need to not to drop the idea of nations, but we need another representation, I would say another geocultural representation of communication, literary communication, social communication, political communication, and so on. Now, from the moment we enter into communication, it's clear that we are going to notice how important verbal communication is, oral, written, audiovisual, and so on. Now, one of the particular merits of research on indirect translation, maybe one of the particular merits of indirect translation is, I would say, the revision of the static world maps. So nations and borders are being redefined because communication is possible. Now, you could say, yes, but all translations are like this. But even our research on translation is guilty for reducing the perspectives that we notice too much to bilateral relationships. So indirect translation is one of the strongest arguments. Sorry for the parenthesis. Indirect translation is one of the strongest arguments against that binary approach that is widespread nowadays. The binary approach that says translation is a matter of source and target tension. Translation is almost always, if not always, also submitted to other relationships, and indirect translation is one of these relationships. Now I come back to that question of power. It's very clear that indirect translation in history has been linked with dominant cultures, the dominant languages. Of course, with so-called the view on the other. So how could we have translation and communication in more than one language? Let's not say into two languages. So if we want to say things that are a little bit relevant about translation, it means that it's always an attempt to enter into contact with people representing other environments. So say other cultures, and the view of the other is of course obvious. Now, indirect translation very often has some particular merits because it brings into our own world, small world, it brings into our own small world faraway cultures. That's also mentioned in that Wikipedia text. So my general answer to Marie-Hélène's question would be yes, definitely. And this may be an additional reason for dealing with research on indirect translation. And as far as I know, Latin America, it's clear that indirect translation on the Latin American continent and on the American continent is widespread and heavily underestimated. I would not say unknown. So yesterday I read an article about the question of languages in Brazilian universities. Now the experts, the international experts, treat Brazil like a country that is monolingual. How can you imagine this? So the world has more than 7,000 languages. How can we explain, I would say, the number of languages used at UNESCO and so on, if not by power or prestige, which is another name, and so on? Sorry, I stopped. That must be. If additional questions, please go ahead.
Yes, we have one more question. This one from Professor Pablo Cardelino at the University of Brasilia. Is indirect translation a mediation mode preferred by hegemonic cultures? Do these cultures protect their hegemony by being the intermediate cultures?
Okay. I'll also start by a short answer first. Read the internet. Of course, you can hardly avoid English. And say, well, that's what I have been doing in recent days. Read the internet about the internationalization of universities. A rich topic, often treated in the recent years. Now, it's full of articles coming not only from the United Kingdom, but heavily from the United Kingdom, where it is told that so many cultures are in trouble with internationalization because they don't read or they don't make use of English. Now, how can we contradict them? Of course, but there's hardly one word about internationalization and other languages. So the Anglophone intellectuals of the highest kind, experts in matters of internationalization and languages, make use of the necessity of English in order to leave the impression that the entire world is English. And that if you don't make use of English, you don't really belong to this world. So you are excluded to make use of the concept that I have used in our discussion. Maybe I forgot other components of this question, and I'm sure this is an important question.
Well, I can read it again if you want.
Excuse me?
Should I read it again?
Maybe you read it again. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
So the entire question was, is indirect translation a mediation mode preferred by hegemonic cultures? And the next segment says, do these cultures protect their hegemony by being the intermediate cultures?
Okay. Well, I see immediately one component that I did not explore, and that is crucial, and that I owe to Ibn Zohar. One of the merits of Ibn Zohar's theories is that instead of doing like so many sociologists and politicians and so on, that is focusing on internationalization and globalization, mainly from the point of view of the so-called hegemonic cultures, what Ibn Zohar stresses heavily, and I would say indirect translation is a wonderful illustration of that, that is that indirect translation and translation as mediation is very often one of the privileged weapons against hegemonic interaction. But the problem is indeed that hegemonic power is often and systematically confirmed by the mediation that is organized by the dominant cultures and languages and translations. But there are remarkable illustrations of the opposite. One of the illustrations I can't avoid mentioning it. I quote Anthony Pym, who comes from Australia, as you all know. There was a conference at a given moment where a young scholar from Turkey said, yes, but why does translation studies and that kind of research again come from the dominant cultures and languages? And Pym's reply was, coming from Australia, this is exactly wrong because translation studies started in the peripheries. And notwithstanding peripheries, has been overcoming quite a few barriers. Whether this will continue to be like this, it's clear that some of the dominant cultures, even in translation studies, make use of their power. I could give clear examples. So long series of examples of this. So I would say I think I have answered the dominant question, but I have also answered the counterpart of that question. And I mean, culture is more complex and indirect translation is more complex. It's because we have a too dominantly synchronic view on culture, and we do not know enough or we don't remember enough about diachrony and about history and culture, and we did not investigate enough that kind of questions. So the answer to many among these questions is we need the research. That's what has been told by descriptive translation studies. And I know some texts that try to say that descriptive translation studies is dead. Maybe that's because they don't like it on the basis of, I would say, their dominant culture.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Yeah, you are welcome.
I don't believe we have any other questions. Professor Walden, would you like to say a few words?
I would not insist myself. I would say that I am happy with these questions, and that I have the impression that we can be happy to have had our session. Now you are also welcome in writing, so my email address must be available. If not, look for the email address of my institute in Leuven, etc. But you can find it also in, I would say, also, of course, at UFC in Fortaleza.
Yes.
Thank you so
everybody
much.
who's watching, Professor Lambert's email is in our group chat. You can find it there. Leave it here
Okay.
one more time. And if you have any other comments or questions, you can forward them by email.
Okay. Thank you again, Mr. President. Thank you again, Tadeo, for helping us. Thank you, everyone. I know so many young people who have been helping. And I'm glad to notice also that not also Fortaleza in Brazil was taking part in our session. And I would even say that Marielen Torres, who teaches in Brazil, also at Fortaleza, again, may have got in contact with so many ideas of that via the research groups that I have mentioned. Have a good night. Thank you. Thank you also, especially Walter, Professor Sun, and the full team from Shanghai SISU. Thank you. Good night.
Would anybody else like to say a few closing words?
Anyone? I didn't understand well, but it's probably to the audience.
Yes, I was talking to our audience, but I don't believe any other comments will be made for the time being. Once again, if you have any other questions or comments, Professor Lambert's email is in the group chat. You can find it there. Well, if that was
I'll always be happy to meet you later and to remind us of our session tonight. Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, all.